So the next area I'm going to paint is the mountains. So a couple things just to remember about painting objects, especially when you are showing them from a great distance. So one of the things to keep in mind is something that's called atmospheric perspective. And what that means is that objects that are farther away from you appear lighter in color and value than objects that are closer to you. Or the other way to think about it is the colors are less intense the farther away they are from you. So if I think about the objects that I see here, my brightest, most vibrant colors are going to be the objects that are closer to me. So the trees, kind of this front area of the meadow. And then as things go farther away, the colors are going to become lighter. So the same thing applies to these mountains. So I've got a little bit of layering here, which means that these two mountains are closer than this one. So this one, when I paint it, I'm going to paint it a slightly lighter shade of gray than I am these two front mountains. Now, I'm probably gonna add some kind of texture or maybe even some snow to these mountains just to give it some visual interest. So for now, I need a base layer of color. Again, we're trying to build up layers so that way we have just some more interesting color tones, a more interesting tonal quality to the painting, and that comes from building up the layers. So I'm gonna mix a lighter gray for this smaller mountain that's kind of farther away, and then ones that are slightly darker for these two mountains. So I've got the gray that I started with for my underpainting. The paint is still wet, easy to work with, so I'm just going to do the same thing that I did with the blue, and I'm going to dip the brush, which I have now cleaned thoroughly so there's no more blue on it. I'm gonna dip that into the oil and start pulling some of this gray. Now, because I want this one to be lighter, I'm going to also pull in a little bit more white, so that way this back mountain is a little lighter. So I'm putting that brush stroke down. That's actually way darker than I want it to be, so I know that I need more white. So I'm just going to pick up some white on my brush and blend it right on the canvas. So I tend to do a lot of color mixing right on the canvas because the paint is just really easy to work with, and this is one of the things that I love about oil paint is how malleable and how blendable the colors are. And that's, once you get the hang of it, makes it really fabulous to work with. Now, some people get a little frustrated because it's so wet that all of this is just smudging together. It just becomes this blob of paint. So part of that is learning how to control the oil. So if you're finding that your colors are just blobs, everything is blending together, you can't create textures, you can't get any definition in your lines, it probably means that you are using too much oil. So maybe just scale back a little bit. If you have too much oil and paint on your brush and you can't control it, use some paper towel and just wipe up or soak up that extra, and that should make it a little easier. So I've taken off that extra, and now when I go back, the paint moves around. It's not sliding around on the canvas, but I'm able to control it a little bit better. So now for these mountains, they're pretty boring just as these like triangle shapes. So one of the things that I want to do is maybe incorporate some kind of jagged edges or texture to it, because we know from mountains, they're not just these weird triangle shapes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the edge of my brush, I've still got some paint on there, I'm actually going to extend this up a little bit and go into the sky. Again, this will help me with my overlapping because I'll have a nice crisp edge on my mountain. It might make things a little tricky later on if I decide to go back over the sky, but that's okay. If I have to repaint the mountain, it's not a big deal. So I'm actually going to kind of take my brush and see if I can create a little bit more texture just by kind of creating a little bit of a rough edge here. And I'll kind of do the same thing with this side. It's a little trickier with this brush. For those of you that watched any of the Bob Ross videos where he did mountains, you'll remember that he often used a palette knife when making mountains, and that is a great technique to use. Now, you guys won't have palette knives, unfortunately. So I've got my base layer, I've got a little bit of a jagged edge just to add some visual interest, and now I'm gonna go back with my darker gray and start filling in these mountains. So I was about to put the paint down, and then I realized I probably don't want to have to go back over here and drag my hand across. So I'm actually going to now switch and work on this side and see if I can work my way over. So it's a little hard to tell. I think my mountain is about here-ish. So again, I'm going to start with that jagged edge, and then I'm gonna bring the paint down, and I'm just gonna lightly go over the edge of where the tree is. So that way, again, I don't have to worry about any white spots. And if you think about a tree, they're not completely solid all the way at the end of the branches. And so there probably will be some mountain showing through my branches. So I wanna make sure that I've got some gray that goes all the way to the edge of that tree, just like I did with the blue. Again, you know, trees are not solid. It's not gonna be a solid line here. There's gonna be some spots where the sky is showing through. And so I want that to be completely covered with my sky color and then my mountain color. So one of the things that I'm making sure happens as I go is that I'm filling in this texture. I know we've got the underpainting to kind of help us with that, but we do want to make sure that we don't have a lot of the underpainting showing through, especially if there's a big change in color. So what I told you earlier about the exact shade of color not necessarily being accurate is relatively true. But again, if there's a big difference, let's say you change your mind about the color. Let's say I painted the sky blue and then I decided I wanted a sunset. I wouldn't want blue paint showing through my yellow or my pink areas. So if you do change your mind with colors, just make sure that you are filling in the texture of the canvas enough that that underpainting isn't taking away from the color of your objects. All right, now I'm gonna paint this last one before we move on. Okay, so I've got that. There's quite a bit of contrast here. I'm not sure if I totally love that, so I might end up going back and making the mountains a little bit lighter. I could go with either one. I think I might make this one a little lighter. So this is an example of how you can change the color while this oil is still wet. So what I'm going to do is take just the white. There's a little bit of gray just because they're next to each other. There's a little bit of gray on my brush. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and lighten this color just by mixing right on the canvas. So I've got mostly white, there's a tiny bit of gray mixed in and some oil. And what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna go over this. And so what I'm gonna try and do is take that white and blend it in over the whole thing. And so you can see how this works. It starts blending right away. So that is the really good thing about working with oil, is that if you don't like a color, you can pretty much fix it right away. The problem with that though is if you're trying to overlap objects, it can make it really tricky if the paint is still really wet. So if I were to try and, let's say I was trying to paint snow, because the gray had so much oil in it and it was still so wet, I would completely lose that snowy effect because it would blend right into the gray. But because I'm just trying to change the color, it works for this. So now I like this gray a little bit better. I actually like that there's still a little hint of the darker gray at the edge and kind of down at the bottom. I think it gives it a little bit more interesting look to it. So I'm gonna leave it like that, and I'm gonna go wash my brush, and then we'll tackle the meadow area. Okay, so I've cleaned off my brush, and as you can see, I've pretty much just been using this one brush. Because I'm painting larger areas, I wanna use the biggest brush that I have. So I'm going to paint this area. I've cleaned my brush, and just as a reminder, I mentioned it last time, liquid dish soap. This is the best thing that you can use to clean off your brushes, or again, if you get it into your clothing, pretty much 100% of the time, anytime I get oil paint in my clothes, I'm actually able to get it completely out with some dish soap. So if you do get it on your clothes, the easiest thing to do is kind of take this. So let's pretend I had some on my sleeve. If you dab a little dot of the dish soap right on your clothing, right where the paint is, kind of scrub it in, let it soak for a while, and then wash it in cold water in your washing machine. It should come out no problem. So again, use your liquid dish soap to clean your brushes and your clothes if you have some at home. Okay, so I'm gonna paint this meadow area. I'm gonna shift my canvas up a little bit, just to make it a little easier, because I am gonna be mixing some colors now, and I want you to be able to see that a little bit better. So if you remember from the last demo video, one of the things I said was that I was not happy with this color. It was a little darker than what I wanted. So I'm going to mix a new green. I'm gonna use my paint palette, because as you can see, this plate is filling up. Obviously I have a much smaller plate than what you guys have, but I'm running out of room. So I want this to be more of a spring green, kind of like a limey green. So I'm actually gonna start with more yellow. There's actually some green already in there. This is the green that I mixed for the underpainting, so I may bring some of that into this, but this yellow is a little messy already. It's got some green on it, so I'm gonna see if I can use that to make the yellow that I want, or the yellow green that I want. So again, I'm gonna use the oil. I'm just gonna kind of pull at the edge here where it's already green. Hopefully you can see that. And so I'm kind of taking the green that was mixed in, and I'm much happier with this. I want it to be a pretty vibrant green, kind of like this meadow has just come into bloom. Maybe I'll add some flowers later. But I am gonna keep my rules of atmospheric perspective. And so because I'm showing a great distance here, you can tell by the size of the trees, this color should be a lot lighter than down here. So I may end up using more of this green towards the bottom, but I wanna start with kind of this nice, bright, limey green. So I'm putting it on, and on here, it looks lime green. On my canvas, it looks much more yellow. So because I've got some color interactions happening here, I need to make some adjustments. So this is now way too yellow. It looked nice here because it was on a white surface, but now on the canvas it looks too yellow. So now I know I need to pull in some green. So I'm gonna pull some of this green that I mixed for the underpainting and see if I can get it a little bit closer to what I'm looking for. So again, because I have oil on my brush, I can mix with my brush rather than using my thing. So this is much better. This is what I want. Now eventually, I will be adding some like grassy texture here, but for the base layer, I just need to get the shade of green that I want. And obviously with things off in the distance, I wouldn't see the grass way off in the distance like that. It would just be kind of a solid block of color. So this paint, again, it's pretty translucent because it has so much oil in it, and that's fine because the base coat, the underpainting, is green, so it's okay if they kind of interact with each other. So I'm much happier with this color. I really wanted something bright and vibrant for this. Okay, so I'm about halfway in this meadow. Now I want to start transitioning to some of these darker greens. So I'm going to kind of mix those two colors together and start working in some of these darker greens. And so hopefully one of the things that you've noticed is when you start working with the oil, you can see you're not using a lot of paint. So if you kind of look at what I have left, I actually haven't used much paint. Probably the blue is the most that I've used. The other colors, I still have quite a bit of color. When you start mixing with the oil, because it makes the paint more translucent and because it becomes so slick, and oily, obviously, it just flows on the canvas better, and you'll find that you just don't need as much. And again, that's another benefit of the underpainting is because we've got that color underneath, we can let the paint be more translucent as we build up layers. That's also one of the reasons why oil painting have a little bit of a glow to them, is because we've built up these translucent layers and we're letting the oil do a lot of work of making our colors kind of pop or stand out or blend together more. So I'm pretty happy with this color now. It's a very vibrant, much closer to what I had in mind. And again, I've got some of the same issues that I had with the sky. So I've got some blotchiness, some areas where the underpainting, maybe the paint wasn't mixed very well, and so I can see I've got some darker lines here. Now eventually I'm going to be filling this over with some texture of grass, so I'm not too worried about it. I'm going to kind of let my texture and some of the details in this meadow area help cover up some of those imperfections. So I'm pretty happy with the colors that I have now. Remember, we are not doing the trees yet. Those will be some of the last things that we do because we want all of our other areas basically finished and blocked in before we start doing the trees. Because if I need to make any changes, let's say I painted this tree and then I needed to add snow to the mountains, it would be really hard to do that and work around the tree. So the trees are some of the last things that I'm going to paint. So I want to be happy with all my background first before I commit to any details and textures in the painting. So because I've mixed oil in, this paint is still pretty wet, so I'm going to just, for the sake of demonstration, show you. If I touch this, I've got paint on my finger, and now I've got a nice fingerprint there. Now, while it's wet, I can blend that out. But the paint is going to stay that way now for several days, maybe even weeks. If you use a lot of oil, it could take anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months to completely dry before it doesn't feel sticky again. Now, most of the time, for most people, within about 2 weeks or so, the painting is dry enough that you can pick it up, move it around. I know that seems like a really long time for painting, but oil painting takes a very long time. So it will be a few weeks before you'll be able to pick this up, move it around, which is why I recommend that you find a place where you can leave your painting and you don't have to move it around in between painting sessions. Because this paint will continue to pull off. Like, I've got black on me, I've got white, I don't even know where those colors came from. I didn't use a lot of those today. It was probably just from touching my plate. You can't see it, but there's a fingerprint in my sky. I don't know how that happened. So we don't want to have to move our painting around more than we have to. Now, once you've reached the point where you can touch it and paint's not coming off on your finger, it's mostly dry, not completely dry. You know, if you stuck a piece of paper on top of it and then tried to peel it off a couple days later, you'd probably rip the paper. So for it to be fully oxidized and fully finished, it does take a few weeks. So you'll have to be patient with that process. Now, that being said, is as long as this paint is wet from mixing oil, it's going to be hard for me to do those details and textures. So I'm going to leave the painting like this. I'm actually going to let it sit for a couple days before I come back to it and start putting in more details and textures. So I recommend the same thing for you. Once you've blocked in with your first kind of background colors, before you add detail, before you add texture, let it sit for a couple days. Let some of that excess oil oxidize so that way you're not frustrated by all your new colors and details and textures blending into your background. And as always, when you are finished, make sure that you clean up your brushes. If you can reuse the Saran Wrap from earlier, maybe just try and match up those colors again, or hopefully you have Saran Wrap at home. But again, make sure you're wrapping it up tight, kind of tap your colors, make sure that the Saran Wrap sticks. Put the lid back on your oil and make sure that that is set. And then because I've used my palette now, I'm gonna cover this as well so I don't lose any of this paint because I can still use it.